Hi there, boys and girls. Today for story time, we're going to read Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But, achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in his bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is at the top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Very loud snore indeed. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his door, shutting his door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled, even a bird flying high above wobbled. Do you need to shut doors hard? No. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, 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 clump. He steps really loudly. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and then sold him a loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, 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 clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it behind him. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and then sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled, a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. What would you do if Mr. Noisy was being really noisy? Do you have an idea? How would you teach him not to be so noisy? The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down in Wobbletown. Clump, 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 clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Sorry, can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Crash! Bang! Slamming the door. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I said I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Oh, did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? What was that? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up, and out he went. Crash! Bang went the door. And then he went home and went to bed, hungry. He didn't get any bread. He didn't get any meat. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice, a loaf of... Then he stopped, and he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... Then he stopped, and then he thought. Then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home, up the hill. Clump, 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 clump. Then he stopped, and he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Tiptoeing is walking much quieter. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought. Do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly and stepped inside. Then he shut the door very quietly. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never done before. And that was fun too. He opened it and shut it quietly and gently. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. The end. I hope you enjoyed our story today. Mr. Noisy. Don't be as noisy as Mr. Noisy. And did you notice when he was talking quietly, did you notice how he asked for the bread? He said, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Remember, we always use those nice words. It always helps. Even when he asked Mr. Bacon for some meat. I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Good manners. Always works much better. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.